Part 1. The hall was already buzzing long before the event even began. People from the neighborhood had gathered to watch local talents perform, some out of curiosity, others simply wanting a night of distraction from their daily routines. The wooden chairs creaked each time someone sat, and the old lights hanging from the ceiling flickered, as if they were as nervous as the performers waiting backstage. In the front row sat a man who never blended in anywhere he went. He was known by many, feared by most, and disliked by nearly everyone who had ever held an instrument in front of him. He was a famous critic, someone who had the power to lift an unknown musician to the sky or crush their dreams with one review. People whispered when they recognized him. Some wondered why he had come to such a humble gathering. Others guessed he must have been invited by one of the sponsors. Whatever the reason, his presence made the air heavier. Not far behind the curtain, a young man stood quietly with an old violin tucked under his arm. His clothes were simple and worn, the kind that showed years of use. His shoes looked like they had walked too many miles, and the violin case he carried was scratched and chipped. But the violin itself, though old and cracked around the edges, was polished carefully, as if it was the most precious thing he owned. The young man held it close, almost protectively. He took a slow breath. He wasn't used to big halls or crowds. Most of the time, he played on street corners or in markets, where people passed by without paying attention. He never blamed them. Everyone had their worries. He played mostly to earn a few coins or maybe enough to buy bread for the day. But today was different. Someone from the community center had heard him play outside a bakery and invited him to perform. They said he had a gift. He didn't know if that was true. All he knew was that playing music helped him forget hunger, cold, and loneliness. When the announcer finally called his name, he stepped onto the stage with careful steps. The hall looked bigger from up here. The lights shone on him, making it hard to see anyone clearly, but he could feel dozens of eyes fixed on him. His hands trembled slightly, and he gripped the violin tighter. Then a loud voice cut through the hall. "You call that music?" The critic shouted before the young man could even lift the bow. The crowd gasped. Some laughed awkwardly, not because they agreed, but because they didn't know how to react. The young man froze. Heat rushed up to his face. He felt as if the floor might swallow him. The critic leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with a smirk. "Let's get this over with," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I hope it doesn't hurt our ears." A few people glanced at the young man with sympathy, others with embarrassment. The organizers stood near the side of the stage, unsure if they should intervene or let the performance continue. The young man swallowed hard. He had been insulted before on the streets, by strangers, sometimes even by people who tossed coins at him as if he was begging, rather than sharing something meaningful. But something about this moment felt heavier. The critic's words carried weight. They echoed in the hall, and for a second, the young man wondered if he should walk off stage. He looked down at his violin. The strings looked fragile in the bright light, and he noticed a tiny scratch he had never seen before. This violin had come to him when he was just a child. An old traveler had placed it in his hands one rainy afternoon, telling him, "Take care of it, and one day it will take care of you." At the time, he hadn't understood the words, but now, standing on this stage, he felt them. He closed his eyes just long enough to take another breath. He reminded himself why he came. He wasn't here to impress the critic. He wasn't here to prove anything. He was here because someone believed he should be heard, and because music was the one thing in his life that had never left him. With trembling fingers, he placed the violin under his chin. The hall went completely silent. Even the critic stopped speaking, perhaps waiting for another reason to laugh. The bow hovered just above the strings. He inhaled slowly, letting the breath steady his nerves. His heart pounded, but something shifted inside him, a quiet determination. He began to play. The first note didn't ring out strong. It was soft, almost hesitant, but true. It floated gently through the hall as if unsure of how it would be received. The audience leaned in. The critic raised an eyebrow but didn't speak this time. The young man continued, letting each note guide the next. His fingers moved with careful precision, and though his technique wasn't perfect, the emotion behind the music carried it. There was something honest in the sound, something raw that didn't come from lessons or polished practice rooms. It came from nights spent alone, from mornings with empty stomachs, from days when he played simply to feel human. As he played, his nerves slowly loosened. The hall didn't disappear, but the fear did. He felt the familiar warmth rise in his chest, the feeling he always got when he forgot his worries and let the music speak for him. The melody began to grow steadier, fuller, The bow danced across the strings, and the violin, old as it was, responded with a voice of its own. The crowd grew quiet, truly quiet. Someone who had been whispering stopped mid-sentence. A child who had been swinging his legs beneath his chair became still. The lights above flickered again, but this time it felt like they were settling into place, letting the moment unfold. Even the critic leaned forward, though he tried to hide it. His smirk faded just a little. Still, the young man didn't know this. He was focused on the music and nothing else. The notes carried him back to memories he rarely let himself visit. His mother humming softly while cooking, his father laughing as he tapped a rhythm on the table, the sound of rain on the roof during the night he first held this violin. Every memory came alive in the melody, every loss, every hope, every small joy. When he reached the end of the piece, he held the last note as gently as he could. His hands trembled again, not from fear this time, but from the weight of the emotion. The note faded slowly into silence, and then the hall stayed silent. For a moment, the young man felt unsure. Had he done something wrong? Had they not liked it? He lowered the violin slightly, waiting. Then someone clapped, just one person at first, then another. Then the entire hall erupted into applause so loud it startled him. He blinked in surprise, his chest rising with a mix of relief and disbelief. People stood up. Some cheered, some whistled. A few called out words of encouragement. The critic, however, didn't move right away. He sat still, staring at the stage with a thoughtful expression instead of the usual look of superiority. The young man didn't know what to make of it, but for the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not as a pauper, not as a street performer, but as someone whose music mattered. His hands were still shaking as he nodded in gratitude to the audience. He didn't bow like trained musicians did. He simply smiled softly, the kind of smile that comes from surviving something difficult. He left the stage quietly, but the applause followed him all the way behind the curtain. And though he didn't know it yet, this one moment of courage would change everything that came after. The sound of applause still echoed in the young man's mind long after he stepped off the stage. It felt almost unreal, as if he had stepped into a dream he didn't remember falling asleep to. He stood behind the curtain for a moment, holding his violin close to his chest, breathing slowly as he tried to calm the rush inside him. People backstage looked at him differently now. Some nodded politely, others smiled with quiet admiration. A few performers, who had seemed nervous earlier, now looked inspired, as if his courage had given them a small push. But he didn't stay to talk to anyone. He slipped out through the side hall and found a small corner where he could sit down. He rested the violin across his lap and gently touched its worn surface. The applause meant something, yes, but the real victory for him was simply that he had played despite the insult, despite the fear. He had stood his ground, but moments like these always brought back memories, the kind of memories that never faded, even when he wished they would. He leaned back against the cool wall and let his thoughts drift. He had grown up in a tiny home at the edge of a busy town. Life there was quiet, simple, and often hard. His family didn't have much, but they had each other. His mother would hum songs while cooking, creating a soft rhythm that filled the room. His father had a laugh that seemed to brighten even the darkest days. They weren't musicians, not in the traditional sense, but they loved music deeply. He remembered sitting at the window as a child, listening to the sounds drifting in from outside, the chatter of neighbors, the clatter of carts rolling past, the distant ringing of bells from the town center. All those sounds mixed together like one big song that never stopped. His parents worked long hours to keep food on the table. There were times when meals were small and nights were cold, but they always found a way to make those nights feel warm with stories and songs. His mother would tap a beat on the table while his father sang, sometimes off-key but always with heart. Those simple moments shaped him more than he realized. One rainy afternoon, everything changed. He was only a boy then, wandering near the old market courtyard, looking for a dry place to sit. He remembered pulling his thin shirt tightly around himself as the rain poured down. The smell of wet earth filled the air. That was the day he met the traveler. The man was older, with a tired look in his eyes but a gentle smile on his face. He carried a violin case that looked almost as worn as his clothes. The traveler had been sitting under a broken awning, trying to shield himself from the rain. When he saw the boy standing there shivering, he motioned for him to come closer. The boy hesitated at first. Approaching strangers wasn't something his parents encouraged, but there was something kind in the man's eyes, something familiar. "Cold day," the man said. His voice was soft but carried a certain melody of its own. The boy nodded. The traveler opened the old case, revealing the violin. Its wood was faded, scratched from years of use, but it still held a quiet beauty. The traveler lifted it with care, as though touching an old friend. "Do you like music?" the man asked. The boy nodded again, this time with more life in his eyes. The traveler smiled. "Good. Music keeps you alive on days when everything else feels too heavy." He gently placed the violin in the boy's small hands. "Here, hold it." The boy stared at him, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Go on," the traveler said, encouraging him. The violin felt heavier than he expected. He held it awkwardly at first, not knowing exactly how to position it. But he traced his fingers along the smooth wood, and felt something he couldn't explain, something warm, something familiar. The traveler watched him closely. "This violin has stories inside it," he said. "I've carried it for a long time, but I think it's time it goes to someone who needs it more than I do." The boy looked up quickly. "You're giving it to me?" The traveler nodded. "Take care of it, and one day it will take care of you." Those words had stayed with him, quiet, mysterious, and comforting. He ran all the way home in the rain that day, holding the violin tightly against his chest. His parents were shocked when they saw it, but listened carefully as he explained what had happened. They didn't know whether to believe the stranger's intentions, but when the boy insisted that it felt right, they simply smiled and told him to cherish it, and he did. He practiced in every spare moment he could find. No teacher guided him. No one corrected his posture or taught him scales. He learned by listening. He listened to the sounds of the world, the wind, the market noise, the soft singing of his mother, and he tried to recreate those feelings through the strings. The violin grew older with him. Its cracks deepened, the strings wore thin, and the bow lost some of its smoothness. But he cared for it gently, always cleaning it, always protecting it, as if protecting a part of his own heart. Then one day, life shifted again. His parents fell ill, and within months, he found himself alone, too young to be on his own, too old to be taken in without suspicion by strangers. He worked where he could, doing odd jobs, carrying goods, sweeping shops. Some days, work was available. Other days, it wasn't. But the violin remained. He played on street corners, not to impress anyone but to survive. Some people stopped to listen, moved by the honesty in his music. Others walked past without glancing. A few tossed coins his way, while others muttered things he learned to ignore. But the violin, his one constant, never failed him. Back in the present moment, sitting in the dim hallway of the community center, he closed his eyes and leaned his head back. The applause from the performance replayed in his mind like a distant echo. It wasn't just applause. It was proof that the years of struggle, the hours spent alone with his violin, the memories he carried, all of it had meant something. He thought about the critic's harsh words. They still stung, even after the performance. But something inside him had changed. Instead of shrinking from the insult, he had faced it, and he had played. That thought brought a small, quiet smile to his lips. He stood up after a few minutes and walked toward the exit, wanting some fresh air. Outside, the night was cool and calm. Streetlights glowed faintly, casting long shadows across the walkway. He took a deep breath and let the air fill his lungs. He thought of his parents, imagining how they would have reacted if they had been in the crowd that night. His mother would have cried, he knew that. His father would have clapped the loudest, probably shouting his name proudly to anyone who would listen. The thought made his chest tighten, but not painfully. It was a warm ache, the kind that comes from missing someone deeply but lovingly. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if the critic's reaction meant anything, or if this performance would lead to more opportunities. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, this path he had chosen out of necessity might someday become something more. He looked down at his violin once more. The traveler's words returned to him. "Take care of it, and one day it will take care of you." Standing there under the soft glow of the streetlights, he felt those words settle in his heart like truth. Maybe that day was finally starting. The night outside the community center was quiet, but inside the building people still talked about the young man's performance. The halls hummed with conversation, and every so often someone mentioned the moment the crowd had gone silent as he played. But he had no interest in staying to hear any of it. The calm outdoors felt gentler, easier to breathe in. He started walking, not heading anywhere in particular, just following the path that led away from the lights. His violin case swung lightly at his side. His heart was still full from the performance, but part of him didn't quite know how to feel. He had never been cheered for like that before. The sound of so many hands clapping at once had felt like a wave crashing into him. As he reached the small park across the street, he sat down on an empty bench. The trees around him rustled softly in the breeze. A few stars peeked through the clouds above. For a moment, he let the quiet settle over him, giving his thoughts room to rest. He didn't expect anyone to approach him. Most people from the event were still inside, probably enjoying the rest of the performances. So when he heard footsteps coming his way, he straightened a little but didn't turn immediately. The footsteps slowed as they reached the bench. Then a familiar voice spoke. "You play differently than most young musicians." The critic. The young man's stomach tightened. He wasn't afraid, but the memory of the earlier insult still stung. He turned slightly and saw the critic standing a few steps away, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on him, not with a mocking smirk, but with a strangely thoughtful expression. "May I sit?" the critic asked. The young man hesitated. He didn't know if he wanted company, especially from someone who had publicly shamed him, but refusing felt unnecessary. So he nodded. The critic sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving space between them. For a moment, neither spoke. The night felt heavier with him there. Then the critic let out a slow sigh. "I shouldn't have said what I did earlier." The young man kept his eyes on the grass. He didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to hearing apologies from people like this. The critic continued. "I judged you before you played. I thought you were just another performer trying to take up space on a stage meant for trained musicians." He paused, then added quietly, "But I was wrong." The young man finally looked at him. The critic's face wasn't harsh now. It was calmer, almost soft. "You play with feeling most people can't even imitate," the critic said. "Your sound, it wasn't perfect, no, but it carried something real." The young man wasn't sure what to say, so he simply nodded. He didn't know if he trusted the critic, but hearing those words did ease something inside him. After a moment, the critic asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" The young man hesitated again. Part of him didn't want to share his story with someone who had mocked him, but another part of him knew that explaining his journey wasn't a sign of weakness, it was the truth. So he told him, not everything, not the deepest details, but enough. He spoke about finding the violin through the traveler, about teaching himself by listening to sounds around him, about playing in the streets to survive. The critic listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When the young man finished, the critic leaned back slightly, almost as if absorbing the weight of the story. "That explains it," he murmured. "Explains what?" the young man asked. "Why your music carries so much honesty." The critic replied, "You've lived your notes. You didn't just practice them." The young man wasn't used to praise, especially from someone like this. He looked down at his hands, unsure what to do with the sudden warmth rising in his chest. Then the critic stood up. "Come with me." Just for a moment, the young man blinked, confused. "Where?" "There's something I want to show you," the critic said. "Nothing strange, I promise. Just follow me." The young man debated for a moment. He didn't fully trust the critic, but he sensed no harm, and curiosity tugged at him. He stood up and followed. They walked back toward the community center, but instead of going inside, the critic led him around the building to a door at the back. It wasn't locked. The critic opened it, and inside was a small practice room. The lights inside were dim, but enough to see clearly. A piano sat against one wall. Music sheets were scattered across a table. The critic closed the door behind them. "I've seen many young performers in my life," he said. "Most train for years before they ever step on a stage. But you," he shook his head, "you stepped onto that stage with nothing but truth." The young man shifted uncomfortably. Compliments were unfamiliar to him. The critic walked to a shelf and pulled out a thick notebook. "Do you know what this is?" The young man shook his head. "It's where I keep the names of musicians I believe deserve a chance," the critic said. "I haven't added a new name in a long time, not because I'm cruel, but because I rarely see anything that moves me anymore." He paused, looking directly at the young man. "Tonight, I saw something." The young man felt his breath catch slightly. The critic opened the notebook and flipped to a new page. With a pen, he wrote something. Then he handed the notebook to the young man. On the page, in simple handwriting, was his name. The young man stared at it for a moment, unsure what to feel. It didn't seem real. This critic, this man who had insulted him in front of a room full of people, was now offering him something he'd never imagined. "What does this mean?" the young man asked quietly. "It means," the critic said, "that if you're willing, I can help you get proper training, a scholarship, a chance to learn from real teachers, a path into a world you've never been able to enter." The young man felt the room tilt, not literally, but in the way moments sometimes shift the directions of entire lives. "I know this is a lot," The critic added. You don't have to decide now, but think about it. The young man looked at the violin case in his hand. It had carried him through every hard moment of his life. It had been his shelter, his voice, his only companion. To receive formal training, to step into a world he had only watched from afar. Could he dare to dream that big? The critic stepped closer, but not too close. His voice lowered, becoming more sincere. You are not just a street musician, he said. You are someone who can move people, someone whose story deserves to be heard. The young man swallowed hard. He felt a lump in his throat he couldn't speak around. The critic moved toward the door. I'll leave you alone for a moment. Think about what you want, truly want. He stepped out, closing the door gently behind him. The young man stood in the quiet room, the soft hum of the lights filling the silence. He put his violin case on the table and opened it. The violin lay inside, looking worn but proud. He touched the strings lightly. He thought about the traveler's words, his parents, the long nights playing on cold streets, the applause earlier that evening, the insult he had faced, the courage he had found out, and now this. He closed his eyes. Perhaps this was the beginning of a new chapter. Perhaps this was the moment the violin would finally take care of him as the traveler had said. He opened his eyes again and looked at the notebook on the table. Seeing his name written there felt like touching a dream. He didn't know what the future would hold. He didn't know if he was ready for such a big step, but for the first time, he felt himself leaning toward a yes. Slowly, a small but steady smile formed on his face. Maybe this was his chance. Maybe the impossible was finally within reach. When the critic left him alone in the practice room, the young man stood there quietly for a long moment. The violin rested on the table, its wooden surface catching the dim light like it was waiting for a decision. The notebook still lay open, his name written clearly on the fresh page. It felt strange to see his name in a place meant for people who had teachers, guidance, chances, things he had never been given. He picked up the notebook again, just to make sure he wasn't imagining it. But the ink was real, the handwriting steady. The critic had meant what he wrote, a chance. The very word made his chest feel heavy and light at the same time. He sat down slowly, placing his hands on the violin case as if grounding himself. He thought about everything that had brought him here. Every hour spent practicing in alleys where the wind stole his notes. Every cold morning when hunger gnawed at his stomach. Every moment he had felt invisible. And now, suddenly, someone wanted to help him rise. Someone who had the power to open doors he didn't even know existed. He closed the notebook gently and took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the risk of failing or the possibility of succeeding. Just then, the door opened quietly. The critic stepped back and, not rushing, not pushing, he simply walked forward a few steps and asked, "Have you thought about it?" The young man nodded, though the decision wasn't fully formed in his heart yet. I don't know what to expect, he admitted honestly. No one does, the critic replied. He leaned against the wall, folding his arms. Every musician who ever stepped forward, even the greatest ones, began without knowing what would come. That uncertainty is part of the journey. The young man nodded again, his fingers tapping lightly against the violin case. If you choose to accept, the critic continued, you'll be placed in a program where you can learn properly. You'll receive guidance, training, and opportunities to perform at events far bigger than this one. He paused, then added, but it will require time, commitment, and courage. The young man looked down. I've never had lessons before. What if I'm too behind? The critic stepped forward slightly. Being behind doesn't mean you can't catch up. You already have the one thing many trained musicians lack: soul. Training can shape technique, but soul? He shook his head. No one can teach that. The young man looked back at his violin. He remembered the traveler's voice, soft and weathered. Take care of it. And one day it will take care of you. Maybe that day had come. I want to try, the young man said quietly. The critic's face softened with a calm satisfaction. Good. Then we will begin soon. They left the practice room together. The building had grown quieter now, most of the crowd having already gone home. A few workers cleaned the hallway floors, their brooms brushing lightly against the tiles. The critic walked the young man toward the exit. Come to the music academy tomorrow morning, the critic said. It's not far from the town's central square. I'll arrange everything. The young man nodded, holding the violin case a little tighter. Before leaving, the critic placed a hand briefly lightly on his shoulder. You did well today, really well. Then he walked away into the night. The young man stood under the faint glow of a streetlight, watching the critic disappear into the shadows. It took him a moment to breathe fully again. He wasn't used to kindness from strangers, especially not from someone with influence. He began to walk home, or rather, toward the small room he rented above a bakery. The bakery owner didn't charge much for the tiny space, and sometimes allowed him to sweep the floors in exchange for a loaf of bread. It wasn't much, but it was a place to sleep. Tonight, the room felt different when he stepped inside. He lit the small lamp near his bed and set his violin on the table. The air smelled faintly of flour from the bakery below. He sat down on his thin mattress and let his thoughts wander. He imagined the academy. He imagined standing in a room full of students who had been trained since childhood. He imagined teachers who would watch his every move. The thought made his stomach twist. But then he imagined something else: learning properly, improving, discovering what he was truly capable of. That thought warmed him. He lay down, but sleep didn't come quickly. Excitement and fear tugged at each other in his mind. He kept imagining his parents sitting at the foot of his bed, encouraging him like they always had. He imagined the traveler smiling proudly. Those thoughts finally soothed him enough to drift off. The next morning, he woke early. The bakery below was already busy, the sound of clattering trays and rolling pins rising through the floorboards. The air smelled like fresh bread. He washed up quickly, put on his cleanest clothes though they were still worn, and held his violin case close. Then he stepped out into the morning light. The walk to the academy felt long, not because of distance, but because of nerves. Each step felt important. By the time he reached the central square, his heart was pounding. The academy stood across from the fountain. It was a grand building, far larger than anything he had ever been inside. Tall windows lined the front, and polished stone steps led up to thick wooden doors. People passed by, some carrying sheet music, others musical instruments. He felt small, very small. At the entrance, he paused and took a steadying breath. Then the door opened from inside. The critic stepped out, spotting him immediately. "You're right on time," the critic said. His tone held warmth rather than the sharp edge it had carried the night before. "Come, let me show you around." Together, they walked through the main hallway. The interior was even grander than he expected. Soft music floated from different rooms: pianos, violins, voices practicing scales. The walls were lined with photos of past performers, some known across the country. The young man's chest tightened. "Do I belong here?" he wondered. The critic seemed to sense his worry. "Everyone you see here began somewhere. No one is born ready." They reached a room where a woman sat at a piano, her posture straight and calm. She looked up as they entered. "This is one of the academy's instructors," the critic introduced. "She will test your basics and help us decide where to place you." The young man swallowed hard. His hands felt sweaty. "Don't be afraid," the critic added. "Just play how you always do." The instructor smiled gently. "Take your time. Whenever you're ready." He opened his violin case. The smell of old wood greeted him, familiar, comforting. He lifted the violin and placed it under his chin. His heart raced. But as soon as he touched the strings with the bow, some of the fear melted. He started with a simple piece, something he had played many times while sitting on cold street corners. His fingers moved naturally, tracing the melody as the sound filled the room. The instructor watched carefully, not judging, simply observing. When he finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "You have a natural ear," she said. "Your technique needs work, of course, but your expression is rare." A warm flutter rose in his chest. The critic crossed his arms with a small smile. "I told you." The instructor turned to him. "He will need attention, guidance, and a structured plan. But yes, there is something special here." The critic looked at the young man. "Do you still want this?" Even with the fear lingering, the young man didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said softly. "Then let's begin," the instructor said. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. He was shown practice rooms, introduced to a few other students, and given a schedule for his first lessons. Everything felt overwhelming, but also exciting. By midday, he stepped outside the academy again, this time feeling different, hopeful, nervous, determined. He walked slowly toward the square, thinking about everything that had happened. The sun warmed his face, and the fountain's gentle splash seemed to echo the rhythm of his heart. For the first time, his dream felt real. As he crossed the square, he felt a quiet voice inside him whisper, "You have begun." And he knew no matter how difficult the journey ahead would be, he wasn't turning back. Not now. Not ever. The hall had fallen quiet long ago, but the sound of that final note seemed to remain in the air, floating like a memory that refused to fade. After the performance, life began to shift in ways the young man never expected. Not suddenly, not like a bright flash or a miracle falling from the sky, but slowly, step by step, like dawn spreading from the edge of the horizon. For the first time in his life, people didn't look past him. They looked at him. They saw him. He didn't fully understand how everything started changing. It felt strange at first when people approached him with warm eyes, asking about his story, his music, his struggles. He was used to being invisible. He never played for attention. He played because music had been the only friend who stayed with him, the only voice that listened back. The critic who once shouted at him returned the next day with a softened tone. The man's steps were slow, almost unsure, like someone approaching a truth he didn't know how to admit. He didn't apologize with big dramatic words. He didn't try to rewrite what he had done previously. Instead, he said, in a quiet voice, that he had been wrong, truly wrong, and that the boy's music had shown him something he hadn't expected to see, something real. The young man simply nodded. He didn't know how to respond. The critic then told him about an opportunity one he had never imagined would come his way, a scholarship to a respected academy, a place where musicians with long histories and well-known teachers studied for years, a place where people practiced with polished instruments, not cracked and taped ones like his. He stood there, speechless. It didn't feel real. Could someone like him belong in a place like that? Could someone used to street corners step into halls where every wall echoed with experience and training? He didn't answer right away, but the critic didn't push him. He said the offer would stay open, waiting for whenever the young man was ready. Days went by as he thought deeply about what to do. His life had been simple, shaped by survival and the need to make it through each day. Now, for the first time, he was facing a choice of future, not necessity. He would walk by the academy grounds sometimes, not entering, just watching the students who came and went with confident steps, their instruments kept in fine cases. He would touch the faded case of his own violin and wonder if music could really carry him further than the streets ever had. In the end, he said yes, not because he believed he was worthy, but because he wanted to see how far his music could go if he followed it with courage, instead of fear. His first day at the academy was overwhelming. Everything looked new and bright. The halls seemed too wide, the windows too clean, the voices around him too sure of themselves. He felt out of place in his plain clothes and worn shoes. Some students looked at him with curiosity, some with surprise, and a few with expressions he had seen many times before, the kind that asked silently, "What is he doing here?" But then he opened his violin case. His familiar companion lay inside, scratches and cracks and all. When he held it, his breathing settled. This was the one thing that never judged him, the one thing that never left, the one thing that reminded him he had something to offer. When he started to play in the practice room, others paused outside the door. They weren't expecting the sound that filled the halls. His style was different, unpolished in some places, rough at the edges but honest in every note. His music sounded like he had lived through every emotion he played, and that gave it a depth many had never touched. Slowly, people began seeking him out. Students requested to practice with him. Teachers asked him about his approach. Some told him his playing reminded them why they had fallen in love with music in the first place. The young man never acted proud. He simply listened, nodded, and kept working hard. He didn't care about being praised. He cared about becoming better. Months passed. His growth amazed everyone who heard him. His playing became more controlled, more refined, but he kept the raw heart that made it special. He learned new techniques, new ways of expressing emotion through sound. Yet he never tried to hide the part of himself that came from the streets, from hunger, from loss. He believed that music without truth was only noise. The critic attended his first formal recital at the academy. This time, he didn't sit with arrogance. He sat quietly, waiting, almost nervous. When the young man stepped onto the stage, dressed simply just as he always had been, the critic felt his eyes sting, not from sadness, but from the weight of seeing how far the young musician had come. The performance was breathtaking, not because it was perfect, but because it was alive. Every note felt like a heartbeat. Every pause felt like a breath taken after years of running. The audience remained silent until the very last sound faded. Then applause erupted like a wave. After the recital, something unexpected happened. The critic, who had once mocked him loudly in front of a hall full of people, stood up from his seat and clapped longer than anyone else. The young man noticed, and their eyes met. There was no anger, no bitterness, only quiet understanding. Word of his talent spread beyond the academy. Invitations came from different places, small concerts, community events, collaborations. He never forgot where he came from. Whenever he played somewhere new, he shared part of his story, not to seek pity, but to show others that talent isn't limited by background, that greatness doesn't require luxuries, that music belongs to anyone with a heart willing to feel it. He especially focused on helping children from struggling backgrounds. He visited shelters, community centers, and small schools, playing for kids who reminded him of himself. He saw the spark in their eyes when they held instruments for the first time. He knew that the look of someone discovering a path they never believed they could walk. He used his growing influence to support programs that provided instruments and lessons to those who couldn't afford them. He didn't care about fame. He cared about giving others the chance he once needed. As years passed, the young man became known not just for his music, but for his humility and the kindness he carried everywhere he went. People admired him not because he reached high places, but because he never forgot his beginnings. Even after all his success, he still kept his old violin. He played it often, the same way he always had, letting its familiar sound remind him of every step he had taken. He knew that without those early hardships, without the moments when he nearly gave up, he wouldn't have found the strength that shaped his talent. He learned something important along the way. Sometimes the world tries to measure people too quickly. It looks at clothes, status, wealth, and makes judgments without ever listening to the music inside someone. But he also learned that once people truly hear you, once they hear your heart, they can never unhear it. His story became one that inspired many, not because he rose to fame, but because he proved that courage, honesty, and persistence can turn even the smallest chance into something extraordinary. He became living proof that dreams are not limited by where you start. They grow wherever there is hope. And every time he played, he remembered the moment when a harsh voice once shouted, "You call that music?" He remembered how that painful moment had pushed him to play with everything he had. In a strange way, that shout became the beginning of everything good that followed. But now, no one asked that question anymore. Now, when people heard him play, they only asked where such a powerful sound had been hiding all those years. And he would smile, because he knew the answer. It had been inside him the whole time, waiting for the right moment to be heard.